It marks 10 years since the bodies of 11 women were found buried on the outskirts of Albuquerque.
In 2009, a woman walking her dog on the West Mesa near 118th Street discovered a large bone in the dirt, leading police to excavate the area. One by one, authorities uncovered the bodies, including one of a pregnant woman.
What is up, Iwu crew? Today, we will be discussing the story of an unassuming woman from the West Mesa area of New Mexico who stumbled across a piece of evidence that would begin the biggest criminal case Albuquerque had ever seen. The investigation that followed is still one of the most infamous in American history. February in Albuquerque, New Mexico is mild, even with some rather cold mornings. It was one of these brisk mornings that a woman walking her dog made a grisly discovery. They were out in the West Mesa area when her dog started sniffing around something sticking out of the dirt. When the woman leaned down to see what it was, she came to a horrifying realization. It was a human bone. To fully understand this case, it's important to understand the humble beginnings of the West Mesa area. Before 1980, West Mesa was just one of the many natural outcroppings that surrounded the city. But as Albuquerque began to grow, this long, flat piece of land just outside the city was one of the first areas pegged for development. Construction crews began clearing the scrub from the top of the mesa, paving the way for over a dozen housing developments. This West Mesa area quickly became one of the best places to live within the city limits. In the early 2000s, the area's population soared to over 200,000. More housing developments were planned, and construction crews spread even further into the scrublands. But in the mid-2000s, housing prices started to freefall. Construction companies started pulling out of West Mesa, waiting for more stable pricing. But that time would never come. When the housing bubble burst in 2008, the crews officially abandoned the cleared land, leaving many of their communities half-finished. Communities like 118th Street. Around this time, Christine Ross and her husband had just purchased one of these new homes in West Mesa, despite the neighborhood being mostly a ghost town. Like many others, they still believed that the market would recover and there would be new neighbors within a few months. Christine had taken to walking her dog, Ruka, through one of the abandoned housing developments along a walking path that snaked through the packed earth lots, especially on cool winter days, like February 2nd, 2009. It was Ruka who first saw something sticking up out of the tan dirt and trotted over to sniff it. When Christine caught up with her dog, she immediately knew it was a bone. But there was lots of wildlife in the region that had moved back into the area when it was clear that the humans had put a pause on all of their disruptive construction. She reasoned that a bear or coyote could have left the carcass of an animal there years before. Christine took a picture of the bone with her phone and texted it to her sister, a nurse, who identified it quickly as potentially human. Christine called the police, who quickly determined that it was, in fact, a human bone. Some thought it was a femur, while others believed it more closely resembled a rib bone. Regardless, everyone agreed on one truth. Where there was one human bone, there is likely to be more. They began excavating, expecting to find bones from a single person, probably not even a full skeleton. What they found, however, was evidence of a serial killer, one that had been operating for over a decade unchecked. Because the site had been prepped for construction, some of the remains had already been disturbed. Bones were strewn across West Mesa. Some were buried far underground. Some had likely been picked up and taken away by animals. Despite the scattered evidence, it was clear almost immediately that investigators were dealing not just with a single victim, but what turned out to be 11 murdered women. It was exceedingly difficult to determine any information about the exact causes of death, and medical examiners found it impossible to pin down the method of homicide. Were these murders supplemented by weapons, such as knives or guns? Or did this killer work with their bare hands? With no witnesses and only bones to work with, officials couldn't say for sure. And that made matching the victims to already convicted criminals with known methodologies much harder. When unidentified human remains are found, the biggest clue to who the perpetrator might be is usually the identity of the victim. Most people are murdered by someone they know, but this is not usually the case for serial killers. It was a huge puzzle, one that ultimately took months for the police to fully piece together. In the end, they were confident in saying that they found 12 separate skeletons, including that of an unborn child, buried in between 2000 and 2005, likely all murdered by the same person, the serial killer stalking the streets of Albuquerque. By the time the authorities had sorted out the different remains, they had already identified a woman named Victoria Ann Chavez, a prostitute who had been reported missing by her mother in March of 2005. According to the victim's probation officer, attempts to get the struggling young woman's life back on track hadn't been getting through to her, and unfortunately, she would never have the chance to start a better life for herself. Sadly, analysis of her remains indicate that she may have even been missing for up to a year before anyone even noticed to report her disappearance. Chavez's identification was the beginning of a sickening pattern that would soon follow for the other skeletons. 9 months later, the 10 other victims were identified. The vast majority of them had been escorts, walking the streets of Albuquerque's seedier neighborhoods. Some had been reported missing by their families. Others were assumed runaways. Whether they were Albuquerque natives or had ended up there from out of state, they all shared something in common. The police had not cared to look for them when they were reported missing. It was only after discovering the remains that the police would take the investigation more seriously, identifying 19 persons who fit the profile of the serial killer. The police dubbed him the 118th Street Killer, but the media chose a much more sinister title, the West Mesa Bone Collector. The 11 women identified were Jamie Barella, Monica Candelaria, Victoria Chavez, Virginia Cloven, Selania Edwards, Cinnamon Elks, Doreen Marquez, Julie Nieto, Veronica Romero, Evelyn Salazar, and Michelle Valdez, who is believed to have been pregnant at the time of her murder. Families had been reporting their loved ones missing for over a decade. But, as is the case with most big cities and police departments, missing streetwalkers and drug users are not at the top of the priority list. The police cited the fact that many families did not report their loved ones missing until years after they disappeared. Therefore, years after potential witnesses had faded into the background. And many of these women lived transient lives anyway. The families were often told to sit tight and wait. Maybe they'd turn up at the next birthday party or Christmas dinner. Maybe they were off getting clean. Maybe they had taken shelter in an alleyway somewhere. Their appearance so changed by the years on the street that they were no longer identifiable as the happy, smiling girls in the pictures. But what made them unimportant to the APD is what also made them the perfect victims for a serial killer. They were vulnerable. Those who worked as escorts would have been easy to coax into a car. They would be used to driving away with a John. The other street workers might not even think twice if they didn't show up again for a few days. And no one looked too closely at the faces of the men who drove around the back streets of Albuquerque. He could be invisible. his victims would be missed, but the streetwalkers who would have quickly recognized the disappearance would be unwilling to contact the police. And even if they did, the probability of it being seriously investigated would be very low. Even if their families did know they were gone, neither they nor the police could be sure if they had been snatched off the street by a killer or simply skipped town. But now that the APD had 11 victims to contend with, they were paying attention. Investigator Ida Lopez, however, had always been paying attention. She had long been fighting for the department to investigate streetwalkers and runaways reported missing over the past decade, after originally being assigned to Michelle Valdez's case when her family had reported her missing. Now, she was one of the founding members of the 118th Street Task Force. At the beginning of the investigation, in an attempt to assuage the rising panic in Albuquerque, the police refused to label this a serial killer. For one thing, they said most serial killers stick to a specific profile. They stuck to the narrative that these women were different races, wildly different ages. Some were drug users, some were not. But in reality, the differences between the victims weren't so great. Besides their coinciding backgrounds as street workers, all were between the ages of 15 and 32, and the majority of them were Hispanic. Perhaps it was presumptuous to conclude that this killer didn't have a general victim profile. It was a relief for many families to finally lay their loved ones to rest. Yet doing so confirmed the police department's worst fears. They could no longer ignore the fact that there was indeed a serial killer operating in the area. Someone who had carefully and methodically picked up, murdered, and buried women from right under their nose. Despite their differences, they were all on Ida Lopez's list of missing streetwalkers. But when it came to putting a face and a name to the killer, the police were stymied. The case was a non-starter. Most of the women had been buried without any identification or clothing. The remains themselves were almost entirely skeletonized. And even if there were marks on the bones, it was impossible to know if those marks were left by the traumatic event that had ended their lives, or by some piece of construction equipment scraping over the burial sites. The only tangible evidence was an eerie piece of satellite imagery. Taken in 2004, it shows a set of tire tracks leaving the main road and ending right at the burial site. You can see a pair of fresh graves in the dirt. Allegedly, when construction had been halted in that area, nearby residents had complained about frequent flooding at the unfinished site. When a developer dealt with this problem by installing a retention pond, the extra water collecting in that lower area most likely caused the unintentional unearthing of the buried bones. If not for this strange coincidence, the bones may have remained a dark secret to this day. The chief of police tried to reassure Albuquerque citizens by saying, "The remains are all old. They've been there a number of years. Had we been finding fresh remains, I'd be much more concerned. Everybody can be reassured that there's not an active serial killer in Albuquerque, actively preying on people." Was the fact that the killer had apparently stopped operating in 2005 a clue? There is a belief among most cops who hunt serial killers. The killer will not stop until he is jailed or no longer alive. If he appears to leave one city, he'll become active in another. So, for the West Mesa Bone Collector, which was it? To answer that question, they would start combing through assault reports. Had anyone specifically targeted escorts? Anyone who had moved, passed away, or been thrown in jail in 2005 or 2006? The first real lead the APD chased down was Ron Irwin. He lived in Missouri, but often came to New Mexico to visit the state fair, which is still held within miles of the burial site. The police raided his home, recovering hundreds of pictures of people all over Albuquerque, including a number of streetwalkers. Police became particularly suspicious of photographs of 8 women who appeared to be unconscious at the time of their photographing. But all but 2 have been identified, and none matched the profiles of any of the 11 known victims of the serial killings. In the end, the search came to naught, and he was cleared of all charges.
Investigators have had the pictures for a while and have spent a lot of time trying to identify these women on their own, but they have not had much luck.
Authorities continued to run through the usual suspects. The local pimps, many of whom had worked with one or even a few of the women over the years, and the criminals, who had been accused of assault and other violent acts. No one seemed good for it. No one even came close to being a good suspect. The police began to lock down on the media, pressuring news sources to keep the story quiet. They were taking criticism from the families of the victims and the public alike, and for good reason. They had let a serial killer operate in Albuquerque for years without anyone, except Ida Lopez, taking notice. In 2010, a private investigator hired by the family of one of the bone collector's victims allegedly began receiving menacing phone calls and emails from an anonymous source. Whoever it was claimed to know who the killer was, though they failed to ever provide a name or any concrete evidence.
You know who I am.
An anonymous caller left those words on the answering machine at the Final Notice Investigative Services Group several days ago.
He stated, "You know who I am." And I said, bingo.
Dr. George Walker Sr. says he immediately recognized the voice. He says the same man sent him an email and left several messages last year claiming to be the West Mesa killer. At the time, Walker was investigating the disappearance of Nina Herone, a woman who police once thought might be a West Mesa victim. She did not end up being one of the 11 women found in the desert, but to this day, Herone remains missing.
I know Nina. I know who killed her.
The private investigator once told the media that he believed the bone collector had simply moved on. He saw that Albuquerque was expanding farther into West Mesa and knew that his burial site would either be built over or discovered sooner or later. Either way, it was no longer safe to dump in Albuquerque. If he'd just quietly moved away, it would be nearly impossible to track him. But then, the police finally caught a break. One of the investigators stumbled across Lorenzo Montoya's file. Allegedly, he was a frequent visitor to the seedy underbelly of Albuquerque. Many of the women who worked the streets there knew about him, and perhaps even more damning, he lived within 2 miles of the burial site. In 2006, it was reported that dirt trails have been found leading directly from Montoya's trailer to the burial ground. What's more, he had already been arrested in 1999 for attempting to strangle a prostitute. The police couldn't round him up for questioning, however, because he was no longer alive. In 2006, he'd come into contact with another escort named Sharika Hill online. When they met up, he allegedly assaulted and murdered her. As he was trying to put Sharika's lifeless remains into the back of his truck, Sharika's pimp showed up and fatally shot Montoya. It has been noted that the murders only took place before his death. This fact serves as a primary source of suspicion from law enforcement. Another suspect was Joseph Blea, an Albuquerque native. He was brought to the attention of the police by his own wife, who reported that he often dumped garbage near where the remains were found, and that he was known to pick up streetwalkers in Albuquerque. She told the police that he hated these women. She also grew suspicious after discovering an inexplicable stash of women's jewelry in her home that didn't belong to her or her daughter. Even more disturbing, she found a large collection of women's underwear in the family's shed. 8 feet underground, alongside one of the victims, the police found an ID tag for a plant that was purchased from a local nursery. When they called and talked to the nursery, they found that Blea had purchased plants just like the one they found the tag for at the crime scene. He had also been brought up on assault charges in the past. His current and ex-wives claimed that he was violent, and he'd been arrested in 2008 for assault. As a result, he had to submit his DNA to the state. When authorities ran the DNA through the database, it matched the DNA from several decades-old kidnappings and assaults. When his vehicle was initially pulled over, officers found electrical tape and rope inside. New information came to light in 2014, implicating Blea's involvement in a string of assaults which occurred back in the 1980s. He was sentenced to 90 years in prison for those crimes, but the police have declined to file further charges, even though he has reportedly bragged to cellmates about having known some of the bone collector's victims. In the end, there are no clear answers for the families of the 11 women murdered and buried out in West Mesa. Some cling to Montoya as the murderer. Others believe it was Blea. According to theories, either of them could have been the bone collector, as one was imprisoned and the other was murdered shortly after the kidnappings had stopped. In reality, it could have been someone else entirely. And of course, as many popular online theories posit, this tragedy could have been the result of more than one killer working together in some sort of twisted operation. Some have even speculated that multiple unrelated killers could have unintentionally used the same burial site. But admittedly, this theory seems the most outlandish. Ultimately, without DNA, without witnesses, and without a confession, it is unlikely that we will ever truly know who murdered those 11 women. APD Public Information Officer Gilbert Gallegos emphasized the ambiguity of the search, saying, "There are misconceptions that there are only one or two suspects. They want to emphasize that there are more suspects out there that they want to consider." He also corrected the misfounded belief that this serial killer investigation has gone cold. In 2016, the Albuquerque Journal reported that a once robust task force of investigators working on the case had since dwindled down to only one lone full-time detective. However, Gallegos claimed in 2019 that a task force of highly skilled detectives is still assigned to the case, working 40 hours a week to secure justice for the many victims of a nameless evil. The 10-year anniversary of the gruesome bone discovery has come and gone, and if what Gallegos says is true, the hunt for the true killer has no end in sight. What we do know, however, is how easy it is for a serial killer to hunt in a city that is largely indifferent to his victims. Recent studies show that there are upwards of 2,000 serial killers operating in the United States right now, if the Murder Accountability Project's numbers are correct. And because most of them choose their targets based on who specifically will not be missed, who will not be investigated, the vast majority will continue undetected. Serial killer expert and professor at the University of New Mexico, Dirk Gibson, gave his 2 cents on the perplexing case. A combination of remoteness of time and geography made it so that there has been little pressure on the police to investigate. To him, it's highly likely that a second boneyard exists in the city, what with all the construction and abandoned sites that existed at the time of the burials. The professor also mused that it's not just the police who didn't care all that much about the victims. Albuquerqueans don't relate to the victims, he shared. They think they're just a bunch of hookers and drug addicts. In the end, he believes that a police department with an already limited budget just isn't going to spend their time fighting for justice if they believe the victims in question, quote, had it coming. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. A playlist is going to pop up right now with more videos you'll love. See you guys next time.